in Tanzania, the vast majority of Tanzanian people don't think of themselves as Black necessarily. They think of themselves as Tanzanian. And that was just such a like a mind kind of blowing experience thing for me.
Mhm.
Because there's so much beauty, there's so much brilliance, there's so much resilience, there's so much history in the US that comes with Black as an identity. I
Yeah.
mean, there's also so much pain and there's so much kind of trauma and there's so much, sort of armor that we have to put on to just sort of navigate the world. And it just becomes normal where we don't notice that we kind of do these things for self-protection and self-preservation in the States. So all of that sort of weightiness of being Black in the US, local people in Tanzania, it doesn't like it's not a thing.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Welcome to Represented, the podcast. I'm Aniki Shuru, racial equity coach for online business owners who want to be intentionally inclusive by building a business that is racially equitable. I created this podcast to normalize the conversation around racial inclusion so that fear is no longer the barrier that gets in the way of doing this work. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Whether you're taking your first steps or you're well-versed in the journey towards racial equity, this space is for you. So welcome home, friend. Let's get started.
From coast to coast, around the globe, we are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
We all know first impressions count. Yet, rather than putting their best foot forward, most big-hearted, well-intended coaches are unknowingly starting their relationships with their prospective Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color clients off on the wrong foot by making statements such as the following. No, 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 no. Where are you from originally? Wow, your English is so good for a Black person. Your skin tone is not dark enough. Are you sure you're from Africa? We have a scholarship program to support people just like you. These subtle yet gut-punching microaggressions can feel like death by 1,000 cuts for a person of color as they are continually reminded they don't belong. That is why I've put together a training called Microaggressions 101, where I help you to understand how to hold safer spaces in your online coaching business that will see you serve a wider and more racially diverse audience. For instant access, head over to anigishuru.com/LT. That's anigishuru.com, GICHURU.com/LT. The LT is for live training, and you can find this link in the show notes. This week on the podcast, I've got Tony Nabors, who is the founder and principal consultant of Racial Equity Insights. He has over 20 years of experience in anti-racism training, consulting, strategy development, public speaking, team leadership, and program management. Tony is also the first person to hold the position of Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the state of Washington for a public housing authority. He is passionate about advocating for a world where all people have equal access to thriving and success, and he champions the voices and needs of the disenfranchised. I have loved having this conversation so much with Tony. You're going to love him. It's just the way he explains things, and at the core of everything we spoke about came to the conclusion that relationships that we have with other humans is central and is key to our anti-racism journey. And so if you're not yet following Tony, you need to press pause, go find him via the show notes, Racial Equity Insights on Instagram, and follow him. He shares gems of knowledge, information that will help you on your journey. And then come back and listen to this conversation because Tony is amazing. And he really brings us together, his journey from relocating from the US, moving to Tanzania for a few years, and then to South Africa, and right now to Costa Rica. And it's just, he brings a lens with which allows us to see the insidiousness of white supremacy culture and the effects of racism. Here's Tony. Hey there, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Represented Podcast with me, Anigishuru. And today, I have to tell you folks, I am really excited because I am joined by Tony Nabors, who I've been following for quite some time on social media. I had the privilege of being tagged alongside him on Instagram. His handle is Racial Equity Insights. And when I found him, I was like, oh my God, what a gem. Like, I've learned so many things and unlearned things through you. So, Tony, buddy, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Annie. I am honored to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Let's dive in, Tony. So you've been doing this work of racial equity for over 20 years. You don't look older than 20, so I don't know how that's possible. But how did you arrive here to doing this work? Because I often say, and my listeners will say, oh, here we go again with Annie saying this wasn't on her vision board, but nobody ever dreams of, oh, I want to teach anti-racism when I grow up. So how did you arrive here?
Yeah, definitely. That's spot on. I when I was a kid, I thought I was going to be a computer programmer, believe it or not,
Right.
because I love technology,
Uh-huh.
which definitely still serves me to this day.
Yes.
And basically, what happened in college was I took one of the intro computer programming classes. I did fine, but I just realized in that moment that I didn't want a position that would have me just at a desk and not connecting with people. So I just realized personality wise, that wasn't a fit for me.
Yeah.
And I kind of stumbled into this thing called anti-racism before that was actually a word that people knew.
Yes.
I went to the University of Washington in Seattle, Washington in the US, and stumbled into this program called American Ethnic Studies, which is basically anti-racism, the undergraduate major. I was just taking gen eds and stumbled onto this program,
Mhm.
and then my mind was just blown away with just all of this information
Mhm.
about my lived experience in the present and how that connects into history and how it connects into very specific things enacted uh, through people in power. And I was just so mind blown by the information that I learned, was so enlightened in terms of, oh my gosh, I kind of knew some of these
Yeah.
things. I kind of intuitively felt some of these things, but now I actually have language and background to understand life better. And then understanding why life is so often unfair for people based off of skin tone.
Yes.
And just the reason for that, right? So I was just so mind blown by that information and so just transformed and activated by it
Mhm.
that I knew that I wanted to bring that information into my life no matter what I would end up doing. And so many years just I had some positions that had to do with racial justice in terms of the career trajectory, some
Mhm.
not, but still engaging in community, still engaging in my personal life. And eventually I got to a point where I realized I needed to take my own passion and experience and expertise for this work more seriously and get more organized around it.
Mhm.
And that's when I decided to form an official business so I can serve organizations,
Mhm.
schools, nonprofits, governments, et cetera, et cetera, in a more organized way, and to be able to get really clear on how I can help with systemic and structural change on those levels. So business-wise, that's where it started. And then
Wow.
eventually I sort of, again, stumbled into this thing called social media and just
There you go.
decided, hey, let me put some
Mhm.
stuff out there. Maybe this can be a great way to connect with people and also just let a broader audience know what I do. and never expected that social media would take off the way that it has. And so that's been very, very encouraging and surprising, and very much a blessing.
It sure has blown up, Tony. If you're not following Tony, again, his handle is Racial Equity Insights. Go check him out. There will be a lot of ahas and a lot of, oh my goodness, happening on your end. And so he's definitely someone to check out and follow. I am interested to know, because starting this work so many, many years ago when it wasn't a thing at all, how did your family take this on? Because obviously, being Black, there are ways in which we want to protect ourselves. We don't want to talk about the thing that could alienate us, the thing that could potentially close doors or illuminate something that the powers to be would like to keep hidden. How was that received?
You know what? I would say I'm pretty lucky. I think my family has been pretty supportive kind of throughout. I think for them, they were really, really wanting to make sure that I got a college degree. Like that was something instilled in me as a child. But they were gratefully pretty hands off once I got to college.
Mhm.
And then also too the fact that I didn't come from a family where they just put tens of $1,000s into my education. I had to come up with everything all by myself with
I
scholarships and loans,
yeah.
which of course gave me a lot more ownership for my college journey, my educational journey. And I started working. So, I definitely was not specifically doing racial equity or DEI work, but
Mm,
I was working. And so that's basically
absolutely.
my parents' hope, get your college degree, work, support yourself, go forth and be an adult.
Go forth
And
and
so
be
I did
adult
those
and
things.
conquer.
Yeah. Yeah. So, they were pretty supportive along the way.
That's really
And I would
good.
say definitely in more recent years where I've been able to more strongly zoom in on my passion and be able to do that at such a successful level. I've
Mhm.
definitely been even more excited about that.
Oh, incredible. And so the move to Tanzania from the US to Tanzania in 2022, and then on to South Africa, and then currently you're in Costa Rica at the time of recording this. What necessitated the move?
Yeah, there's so many different things that I could talk about.
Hmm.
So my wife and I, we had been at least sort of dreaming about the idea of visiting the continent. Um, we got to a point where we were able to afford a visit.
Yeah.
And so we have a family that we're friends with that lived in Seattle, maybe, I don't know, 10, 12, 13 years prior.
Uh-huh.
And so that's how Tanzania became a place that we at least were aware of.
Yes.
And so, we started locking in terms of, wait, let's actually do a trip. Let's do a vacation. Let's spend a good amount of time. And by that time, I'm working online. Like I'm running my business
Yeah.
online. If I have internet connection, I can work anywhere. So we have that flexibility to travel. And so, yeah, we decided to do a visit to Tanzania. We were there for about 5 weeks,
Okay.
in January of 2022. Yeah, so we're there for about 5 weeks, and it was just a very, very illuminating experience. We had never traveled internationally as a family.
Wow.
We each had very, very small international travels back in like 2021,
Yes.
but never,
Yes.
well into adulthood. So yeah, we decided to go for it. And sometimes things just kind of come together
Yeah.
unexpectedly, where we ended up at an Airbnb that was actually not a good location. Like we didn't realize that it was not a good location.
Okay.
Like we're kind of far away from the main city in a
Uh-huh.
much more sort of rural part of town, which is rough. But that Airbnb host connected us with a local guy named Jonathan, who ended up being an incredible connection for us. He speaks English fluently. Obviously, Tanzanian and he speaks Swahili, and was just such a really good bridge for us to just help us to figure things out as local folks. So we just developed a really good relationship with him. my wife is a natural people connector and community builder, so she's reaching out all over to just a bunch of other um, uh, Westerners, basically, like
Mm.
Black people from uh, um, primarily from the US and UK, just happen to be the people that we're running into.
Yeah.
And yeah, so starting to meet people, starting to get a little vision, starting to get some connection pieces,
Mhm.
and definitely realizing that it was such a distinctly different experience
Yeah.
than what we were having in Washington State in the US. Better weather, um, much friendlier lived experience. This is the
Absolutely.
first time ever in my entire life I could walk in an area and basically nobody notices me, which is actually an awesome experience because I'm
That
used to being
part.
regarded with suspicion, or
Yeah.
sometimes maybe somebody will cross the street to avoid me in the US, or maybe someone will clutch a purse, they think I'm going to snatch the
Yeah.
purse, like all kinds of just racist stereotyping that happens in the US that
Hmm.
just wasn't happening in Tanzania. And so, we decided, hey, what if we tried something longer term? And, I'll be honest, um, my wife was definitely the more passionate, excited one about that. Like she was gung ho. She was like, no, we're doing
Yeah.
this. We've got to do this. I tend to be a lot slower when it comes to big, giant decision making.
Hmm.
But we were able to kind of figure out the logistics to make it happen. And then we made the leap in the fall. And so we were there for about a year and a half. And then we did South Africa for about 3 months. And now we've been here for about 2.5-ish months in Costa Rica.
Wow. As you were speaking, there's so much that I could relate to in the reverse. So for me, I grew up in Kenya, all of 20 years and then relocated to Australia. Actually came here as an international student. The idea was just to study and go back home, but ended up falling in love with this country and just stayed and stayed. And so this is now my home. But I do frequent Kenya because all our relations are there, all our family and everything are there. My husband is from Kenya as well. And so
Mhm.
I can see it from the reverse, where you come from a place where it is just so different and you're treated so differently. Your race is a negative, so to speak. And then you come somewhere else where you're completely blending in, you belong. And there is something about Africans. We just love tourists. We love people who have come from different countries and we love to host them. We love to show them around. And so I can only imagine how that must have felt, just being around and going like, I feel I'm not sticking out for the wrong reasons. People want to talk to me. I can just be myself. And so what are some of the lessons that you've learned from a race perspective, having, travel, and you've got kids too, you've got sons,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah.
so, how has that been? Because I know the American story, particularly being Black and having, to raise young boys, kids, it's a lot to handle.
Most definitely. Most definitely. Yeah. So, gosh, there's so many places I could begin in terms of race, like sort of lessons learned or experiences gained uh, about race. Because race is it's so differently defined and understood in Tanzania,
Yeah.
which also in turn is very different than how it is understood and experienced in South Africa. We can maybe talk about that later.
Wow.
Um, but something it never occurred to me again because all of my experience and context was in the US. Um, in Tanzania, the vast majority of Tanzanian people don't think of themselves as Black necessarily. They think of themselves as Tanzanian. And that was just such a like a mind kind of blowing experience thing for me.
Mhm.
Because there's so much beauty, there's so much brilliance, there's so much resilience, there's so much history in the US that comes with Black as an identity. I
Yeah.
mean, there's also so much pain and there's so much kind of trauma and there's so much, sort of armor that we have to put on to just sort of navigate the world. And it just becomes normal where we don't notice that we kind of do these things for self-protection and self-preservation in the States. So all of that sort of weightiness of being Black in the US, local people in Tanzania, it doesn't like, it's not a thing. They just go through, just do their thing.
Yes.
Um, what I found, at least from my perspective and experience, is that a lot more of the social differences are economic. There's
Mhm.
definitely, there's a lot of poverty and a lot of people that are having to just work really hard on the daily for, their daily needs.
Yes.
So, there's a kind of that, I would say that's where the heaviness is at for people who are, just trying to thrive and live and do their thing, is just people having to work really hard for money to be able to live.
Yeah.
So, people are very creative, people are very entrepreneurial, people are very, they might have this thing that they do the most, but maybe they've got two or three other side hustles, just, making it happen, making it work.
Absolutely.
Um, so in terms of some of these lessons, I think so many of the lessons that I learned had to do with humanity, like sort of the humanization and relationships of people together, in certain ways that I thought these things were upfront and just a part of my sort of daily life, really were not. And so, let me give you an example.
Yeah.
Anytime when you're going to have an interaction with a person in Tanzania, you are first going to, and this sounds so simple, but in the Western world, I found, at least in the US, and I think this is the same for people, at least UK, and I've had relations with people in the UK, taking the time to properly and thoughtfully greet somebody in any situation when you are going to have an interaction, even if you're going to a store or going to a restaurant where you're exchanging money for goods or services,
Mhm.
like you take the time to say, hello, how are you? Good morning. How'd you sleep last night? So habari za asubuhi, like we'd say these, like
Yeah.
taking the time to recognize you put each other's humanity, as opposed to, like, my mind is thinking about the business I'm trying to handle. And so usually I'm gonna come up and say, hey, excuse me, can you tell me where blah 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 is? Or hey, I want to order blah blah blah. And then, they would maybe sort of look at me and then like, hello, hi, how are you? Like they would say that to me. And then I'm like catch myself. Oh, yes, hello, good to meet you.
Hello.
Like just not even thinking of taking the time to pause and greet and say hello. So that's kind of one thing. I would say also just the pace of life.
Oh my.
And gosh, I'm gonna very strongly attribute this to capitalism, where like time is money in sort of,
Yes.
big time Western capitalism centered cultures.
But
Um,
Tony, as you're sharing that, and I'm smiling so hard because it's a little bit the opposite in Kenya. Kenya is go, 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 go. It's like, I need this, I need it now.
uh-huh.
Tanzanians are just so laid back. They're just hawana
Yeah,
shida, pole pole, they're just doing
I
things
was just gonna talk
slowly.
about pole pole. Yes,
They are
yes, absolutely.
just taking their time. And even with some of the videos that I've seen of you by the beach, and like it's just like a bit of a holiday. Yes, people are hustling and they're trying to make ends meet, but there's just a different hum. There's just a different
Yeah.
buzz to it. Whereas in Kenya, it's different. Like, okay, yeah, hello, what do you need? Or can you get me this? Can you help me? It is so, so different. But yes, absolutely. Capitalism has a role to play. But I'm interested to know, Tony, because you bring two things here, the impact of enslavement and now seeing the impact of colonialism, how those two kind of interact together.
Hmm. Yeah. So it's so interesting just to be able to have that more broadened perspective of how that works and how that's happening.
Yeah.
Um, and it definitely really brings to light even a lot of the language that the Western world uses to describe Africa in general. First of all, just even this great interaction that you and I just had about specific nuanced differences between people in Kenya and people in Tanzania, which are, neighboring countries, where I'd say, the average Westerner would have no concept about these neighboring African countries being two
Yes.
distinctly different, places and entities and people, right? So that kind of being a thing that, there's a lot of sort of what do I want to say? Kind of I would say sort of the social homogenization of Africa, where the Western world kind of just regards it as a big giant homogenous
Country.
blob. Right. Talk about it like a country.
Yeah.
As opposed to, what is it, 52-ish countries or however many countries are in the continent?
54. Mm.
54. Thank you. Thank you. And so, just understanding that there are these different countries. But how a lot of the language that comes out where people will talk about, I would say at best describing them as third world countries or developing countries. And, I'll say, certain, again, I just speak from my context. I don't know everything about every country's perspective, but we'll say particular US politicians that have significantly harsher language and worse language to describe, countries in Africa. And so then when you start to understand about the history of colonization, I saw somewhere that somebody just said, hey, stop calling these countries third world countries. Maybe a more accurate description is countries that are still recovering from Western colonization or from Western imperialism. I want to say, gosh, someone can fact check on Google. I think I'm at least close to right on this, but I want to say that recently Tanzania celebrated, I want to say around 60 years of independence, which is really recent, right? Like it's a very recent independence. And so, there's still rebuilding that is happening, and there's still infrastructure that is being
Absolutely.
developed and worked on. And there's still, inequities that exist there where, and I will tell you, this is something that local people have communicated to me. So, I'll say if there's any Tanzanians listening, forgive me if this is not your perspective. This is what people have told to me. But where a lot of Tanzanian people, when they learn that you're a foreigner, will just assume that you are in a better financial place than they are. Even if you're another African, if you're another African, but if you're a foreigner there, they will assume that you're in a better financial place than them. And it was very revealing to see, even in a place like Tanzania, where there's so many people who look like me, so many people who look like you, who are, our skin tone and kind of in that range, that even in those places, when you go to many of the kind of quote unquote upscale neighborhoods or upscale restaurants or upscale establishments, a lot of those are owned by foreigners. Of course, not all of them, but many, a noteworthy number of places and properties in these areas are owned by foreigners. And because foreigners are from places that have the resources to be able to, come to Tanzania and buy stuff. Or find kind of loopholes to buy stuff, or maybe to be able to afford to get a foreigner business license or any of those kinds of different ways. So that's one big thing I'll mention. And then the other thing I'll mention is just how colorism still plays out, even in a place like Tanzania.
It does.
Yeah. And there were just some very, very candid conversations that I had, and I say especially my wife had, because again, my wife is like a superpower for her to connect with people, and it's very surprising how candid people will be with her about their just various life experiences and perspectives. And that is an international power that she has. And my wife, she's biracial, so my wife's mom is white, her dad is Black, and so she actually is considered white in Tanzania, even though in the US she would be considered Black. And then in South Africa, she would be considered colored. But no, if you are like a certain lighter skin tone, it doesn't matter what your background is, people will say you're white in Tanzania, which that was another mind-blowing experience. They're like, what? Huh? But yeah, colorism definitely being a thing. And so one of the local people that we had developed a relationship with, like a friend of ours over time, was basically saying that a lot of the views with like beauty and attractiveness, for example, is that, it's kind of assumed that if you are lighter complected, or if you are any of the range of whites, which apparently is a very broad range, that you're likely going to be considered more attractive. And then if you're a darker skinned Tanzanian,
That's correct.
then maybe you've got to have, be really curvy, or something along those lines to get the same sort of, or at least a similar sort of attention or attractive scene, that kind of thing. So colorism being a thing. And then still
Absolutely.
seeing, certain places where advertising, maybe at a mall, or maybe at a grocery store, and kind of one of these more quote unquote upscale, higher income neighborhoods, still seeing a lot of white representation on, billboards and that kind of thing in some of these areas.
Yes.
Seeing, even in terms of, like, it's a very religious country, especially a lot of Christian and a lot of Muslim. And I'm still seeing, on the side of a church or on the back of a bus, image that kind of classic image of white Jesus.
White
The
Jesus.
sort of,
White Jesus
oh,
is in Africa
these
big
things in Africa,
time.
right?
Yep.
Yes. Yeah. So, these sorts of things, that still very much, I think, have like a programming impact on people. It's much, much more subtle than what we see in primarily white countries,
Mhm.
but absolutely still there and still noticeable.
And you know what you mentioned there, Tony, highlights the fact that as Black people, we're not immune to perpetuating racism. We really are not immune at all. I remember going back home many years ago when I had newborn baby, and I remember looking through the aisle of diapers and going like, oh, kind of looking for what I'm used to because I'm used to seeing like white babies on the diaper packaging. And I thought to myself, I don't know if this is good enough quality because I've heard, nappy rash, like this,
Mm,
that what gets sold in, African countries is the standard is not as high. So as a mom, I was already programmed to think that this was less than because of where I came from and thinking, oh, I should have brought enough to last me for the whole like 5 week trip, which is ridiculous. You can't do that. Uh, and I just saw how that programming, now looking back as somebody who does this work on a daily basis, I'm just seeing how programmed I was, even though I'm Black. And as you're sharing that, I'm just thinking, yes, people may not have left Africa at all to still have these views.
definitely. Yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, that language is language that I use very, very often in my work, is this idea of programming.
Mhm.
Or maybe sometimes if I even want to get a little spicier with the language, maybe I'll talk about brainwashing. Like, I'll use that sort of language.
Yeah.
um, all these different ways where, if we are continuously washed over with certain types of messages that teach us that certain types of things are better or worse, and that certain types of people are higher quality, or more qualified or more capable, I would say even those of us who are gung-ho racial equity advocates and fighters, we can't be immune to those impacts. That's just not human nature. If something is told to us enough times, especially
Absolutely.
if we're not paying attention, we're not looking to resist the programming actively, we can't help but be influenced by it. I remember kind of a similar story for myself to the one that you just told. Um, Particularly when I was brand newly introduced to this work, in college, actually. And so just starting to understand about how racism works, how we receive messages about bias, all these kinds of things.
Yeah.
And then I like caught myself one day, like sitting in a car, I don't know, parked next to the street or something like that. And again, I'm a very Black man. There's no second guessing. I'm very
Yeah.
clearly a Black man, raised around Black people, Black family, very, proud of my culture and background and history. But sitting in this car, and then, a group of Black guys getting ready to walk past my car, and I like feel this super strong pull to make sure my door is locked. And I don't know how many times I might have done that in my life, But because I was in a space of education where I'm starting to learn that that's a thing, I like caught myself. I'm like, what am I doing? Like, why am I doing that? Like these guys could literally be my family. These could be my brothers, my cousins, and yet I'm feeling this like danger sensation. And that was very disturbing to actually catch myself in the act in that moment. And then that just, really revealed to me that, oh, there's something going on in my mind that has taught me things that I have to unravel. I got to figure out how to unravel and learn something better and new instead of that. I can't have that. That can't be a part of how I walk through the world.
That is so true. And many people go through that not realizing. They don't even realize. It's just because it's implicit. It's just part of who
Yeah.
you are, your psyche, how you operate. And speaking of those biases, speaking of how that programming that we have as Black people, on the reverse, white people also have programming that has been, passed on from carer to carer, from, family to family. And you did a survey, Tony, with your community where your white students asking them some of the harmful racial lessons they've internalized about Black people that are not true. Can you share with us some of the things that came up?
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. And so the context of this question was actually me doing a class. And so part of my offerings, I do live classes, IV courses, that sort of thing. And the class was called Developing Your Anti-Racist Heart, Doing the Inner Work. And it's all about uncovering like that subconscious stuff within our program, within our socialization, within our past that impacts how we move through the world today. And so I was talking about this idea of socialization. And so socialization basically is about how we understand how to move through society based off of our social identities. And so there are lessons that we learn based off of all kinds of stuff, based off of your race, of course, based off of your gender, based off of your sexuality, based off of maybe what city you're from, how much money you had, like all these sorts of different things, your family. You're going to learn these lessons about how to engage the world. And so we were having this discussion and dialogue, and the group was even sharing some things about, hey, here's how we see, this is another question I asked the group, how do you see white supremacy in the world? And they would name all these different sorts of different things, and education and uh, health inequities and income, like all these different spaces that they would see white supremacy in. And then I was talked about like, okay, that's really powerful. Thank you for sharing those things. And with that context, with all these different ways that we see white supremacy play out, that's got to connect in with how you've been socialized in terms of, maybe some of these things are kind of more innocuous, like you like a certain type of music, you like a certain type of food. Cool, great, no problem. But let's talk about this sort of rip the Band-Aid off of some of the harmful ways that you've been socialized racially as white people. Like, tell me. I would love to hear, what has that looked like? I'm really creating a safe container where I'm not here to judge you. I'm not here to point at you. I'm not here to call you evil. But
Yes.
let's just have a conversation. Let's get honest. Let's get real about this, right? And that's where people just started sharing these different things. And I've got, like, I've just sort of been tracking all of this stuff. I've got so many. There's way more than I could have fit into a single, Instagram post. But we're talking about being afraid of Black people, this idea that if an idea or a service or a thing comes from white people, it's better. And shout out to you, Annie, for even sharing like how that kind of even impacted your journey of figuring out the diapers, right? This idea of I don't see color and people seeing that as a positive thing, which very much erases the reality of inequity, which we can't fix that if people are pretending it's not there.
Yes.
This idea of you should avoid this part of the city, which is usually where Black and brown people live.
That's right.
You should choose good schools, quote unquote, which are usually schools that are predominantly white. It's like just a host of ideas and lessons that people told me that they learned. I mean, what was interesting too was the way that I asked the question, said, hey, maybe some of these are kind of more subliminal. So maybe you just sort of passively saw certain things that gave you certain ideas. But then what happened is people were telling me, no, this was stuff that was blatantly told to me by my parents, by my community, blatantly telling like, hey, you should, watch out for Black people, these sort of messages and lessons that people are learning and internalizing. And so again, as we mentioned, on multiple levels, we can't help but be impacted and influenced by this flood of messaging that we receive as children. You talk to any psychologist worth their salt, any therapist worth their salt, and especially if you're going for services, like I see a therapist, and I'm a huge proponent of therapy. We're gonna have some conversations about childhood. Like, hey, stuff that I'm dealing with now, stuff that gives me anxiety and stress now, stuff that triggers me now. How does that connect in with stuff that maybe happened during my really formative years that then have just kind of latched itself to me well into adulthood and middle age, right? And this category of racial messaging is not this sort of separate thing that doesn't also latch onto our subconscious and then basically still can kind of steer our rudder even as adults who are passionate about equity and really want to be effective advocates.
100%, Tony. And so I will ask this question, but I have others I want to ask, but I just want you to just percolate on this because what you've said is so powerful in that there's so much undoing and unlearning that needs to happen, and it cannot happen all at once. It's a process of decolonizing our minds, and how Black people decolonize, how white folks decolonize is going to be different based on, how these things have been programmed in us. But I want to talk about the notion of white privilege. And you shared recently about the reframing to it as white immunity. And I thought that was so clever. You did a little bit of research. I think it was Nolan Cabrera, if I'm not wrong, that you had quoted. Tell us a little bit about that, because we all know as educators, the minute you mention white privilege, like nah. I don't have that. So just tell us a little bit about that reframe about white immunity.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So yeah, definitely shout out to Dr. Nolan Cabrera, whose work is what first put that framing on my radar. And so, white privilege, just to paraphrase or kind of put it in my own words, is this idea that because of this history of racism and systems and strategies and all these sorts of different things, there's certain things that white folks have easier access to or don't have to fight for based off of race that basically all the rest of us do. And there's easier access. There's lots of stats you could talk about. Like you can talk about stats relating to, like education, in terms of acceptance rates for universities and those sorts of different things. You can talk about education in terms of, there's a statistic that I read that I want to say, university professors being 26% less likely to answer emails when they come from names that seem to be white names, quote unquote, as opposed to ethnic names. There's a statistic where physicians on average will offer, gosh, I don't remember what the number on it is, but I'll say less pain medication to Black patients compared to white patients with the same injury. Like there's lots of statistics that show off white privilege and lots of examples of that. So I think it's important for us to still hold that and understand that. But I'll say that for me, with my practice and how I work with anybody, whether it be individuals or organizations, effectiveness is at the very top of my strategy. How can I be most effective to getting this message to my audience in a way that they can understand it and receive it? And sometimes the language of privilege can be triggering for people in a way that distracts from what we're trying to accomplish. And so some audiences are ramped and ready to go, which is cool. But sometimes, especially if I'm working with like a business, maybe there's a mixed audience of some people that are pumped and amped about this and some people that are bitter that they even have to be there. And so how can I make sure to get this message to both of those audiences at the same time? And that's why I like to invite the reframe. And so before I describe the reframe, were you about to say something, Annie? It looked like you were going to say
Yeah,
something.
yeah, yeah. It's just so much is just dropping as you're sharing that because effectiveness is the key. At the end of the day, effectiveness is the key. And this is an area where, for me, how I teach this work is very much from a calling in lens rather than a
Mhm.
calling out. You know, I'm not a
Yeah,
Black American. I don't have the experiences that are very much in your face. Here it's quite covert. It is something that the people do not talk about. It's very different, but it is obviously it exists. And so you have to find the language that will help you be more effective in terms of teaching and raising this awareness and getting it to that point of understanding where people are saying, no, I do not subscribe to this. This is wrong. And so what I thought about was the term white fragility
uh-huh.
versus white rage, or the language that we use, or white violence, for example. And we know the whole issue behind, Robin DiAngelo, white fragility, making it palatable for white people. But I honestly,
Yeah,
honestly wonder, Tony, because it's about being effective. And if that can
mhm.
allow more people to come to the watering hole, so to speak, to listen when we
Yeah,
use that kind of language, isn't it to our advantage at the end of the day? Because if we're saying this is white violence, what you're doing, and somebody's like, what? Hang on, I don't even understand this whole concept because it's been programmed in them. And so they don't know it, they can't see it. But if we
yeah,
use language that allows them to take a few steps closer and they go like, oh, I knew it as white fragility, but the more I've done this work, I do realize it's actually white violence. What do you have to say about that?
yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure, for sure. So I love that framing where you're talking about a calling in sort of approach. And so for people that are maybe less familiar with that language, calling in is more of this idea of I want to like invite a conversation. I want to, maybe ask some questions to get
Yeah.
to know what the other person is thinking better. And then, maybe through the conversation, I can find ways to help somebody to understand a new perspective. So, maybe somebody says something that's racially insensitive in a meeting, but maybe like I know this person and I can understand, ooh, ouch, they said this, but they probably didn't mean that. So let me send them an email and meet up with them later to break it
Mhm.
down and help them understand better. Like that's kind of a calling in. Whereas a calling out is maybe I'm gonna just say it really quick. Like maybe they say something in the meeting and they're like, whoa, that was racist.
Yeah.
No, we're not gonna do that. Like it's a much more kind of blunt sort of approach. And so my perspective is there's so much emotional intelligence that's needed to be able to do this work well. And I think even this idea of a calling in style approach versus a calling out, we first have to have the emotional intelligence as well as the self-awareness to be able to discern, hey, this person or this the situation has gone awry,
Yes.
or this language has been used that's oppressive language, whatever the case might be. And then can I understand two things? One, is this person teachable? And and then also too, what is my current capacity? I think especially for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, where we can often feel so much of I would say an unfair pressure to have to be the person to jump in and correct people and that kind of thing. I say especially for us to really kind of weigh in. Do I have the capacity for this conversation? And if both of those are yes, then that can be a great opportunity to say, hey, can I kind of pull you off to the side and let's chat about this. Tell me more about why you said that or what you were thinking, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
However, there can be times where a person has repeatedly shown themselves to be unteachable.
Yeah.
And if a person is unteachable, then I would consider it a waste of time to consider to teach the person if they're not interested in learning. And I think when you're in that situation, the shift should be, how can I move instead of to teaching and
Yeah.
wanting to kind of win over a fellow ally or advocate? How can I instead move into harm reduction? How can
Mm.
I do whatever I can or use my language or use my influence to reduce this person's opportunity to commit harm through their language, through whatever means that they might be using? And that's where a good call out sometimes can get the job done, depending on your relationship with the person, depending on your authority, your influence, and that kind of thing. Whether you're thinking at the workplace or just maybe in personal, regular life, maybe it's a holiday, you're seeing a family member you haven't seen for, a year or two, and they're, every year they're going to make really
Yes.
offensive jokes. They don't care. This may be a little bit of an unpopular thing to say, but I'm gonna say it anyway. I am not above using shame as a tactic to silence and stop harm from somebody who is not interested in learning. And so maybe, it's a holiday thing, everybody's all gathered together, and maybe you just are the one that says, wow, Uncle so-and-so, that was super racist. I don't know why you would ever say that. Stop. And then maybe that's super embarrassing for Uncle so-and-so. But then, maybe in the latter time frames, he doesn't say that again because he knows that you're gonna call him on it, right? Because if nobody says anything, then the harm perpetuates. And sometimes we can be so,
Uncle is not coming
uncle or aunt.
for those dinners again. He is done. He is fit. He is not coming. We just
Thank
lost
you.
Uncle.
Exactly. And so, it's part of the discernment, right? It's part of the discernment, part of the emotional intelligence. And then we also have to have the courage. I'd say so many times where we really, and this is another part of like socialization, right? A lot of us are taught to be nice. And like nice is put up on this super high pedestal in terms of human attributes. And then even in the face of really awful, evil stuff, a lot of people will assume the proper response is niceness. Even in, response to something that is like brutally awful or, violent or whatever the case may be. And again, I think that's where we need to have that combination of discernment and courage to be able to have, sort of learned enough and practiced enough where we can then on the spot, if something's happening or going down, then we have enough practice and understanding to be able to be like, oh, this is a great opportunity for me to pull this person aside. So let me courageously do this. Or, on the other side, yeah, I'm not going to allow that. That is not okay. That's not cool. This person keeps doing this thing over and over again. I'm going to jump in and vocalize.
Yeah. That is such a beautiful, balanced approach. I love how you've given specific examples. That is such a balanced approach. I love that. I want to ask about whataboutism. Because as somebody who does this work and the concepts that you're just constantly sharing, there are a lot of folks in the DMs, in the comments, just waiting to pounce and say, hey, Tony, you're talking about, police brutality. What about, Black people who have this phobia for, such and such? How do you deal with that? Because it just completely knocks you off your, what you're trying to say. It deflects, it derails the conversation. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. So, there's so many different pieces of information and fields of information and just fields of knowledge that are just really helpful when it comes to having effective conversations around race. And so definitely like some psychology stuff that happens so we can understand that, oh, when people are triggered, they might respond in this particular way. Like a whataboutism is basically, hey, I'm talking about a specific, maybe oppressive thing or a specific ism or a specific, race, whatever the case is. And somebody is maybe triggered by that. And so rather than dealing with the point that I am currently making, they want to shift the conversation and say, well, what about how, someone like you might do this other thing that's completely disconnected, which is yucky, especially when it's in the shape of something that actually is a real issue, a real social issue that needs to get dealt with and need attention. But when people will wield that as a silencing stick to stop you from talking about the thing that they're uncomfortable with, it's just really kind of gross. But then also sort of a subconscious reaction or deflection that people will sort of make when they start getting uncomfortable. And so I'd say another field that's helpful is, like the field of like logical fallacies and just understanding how people want to win an argument, so they'll use certain tools that make them or give them the sense of the upper hand. But then when you start to be able to catch it, like, oh, yeah, that was for example, a red herring, which somebody pointing to something completely disconnected from what you're talking about to sort of, throw you off from the conversation that you're trying to talk about. So then you can catch it way more easily and not sort of fall down the pathway. And then, suddenly you're debating with this person about a subject that's completely disconnected from the point that you were trying to make. So, in that sort of example of like a whataboutism, I think if I'm having like a one-on-one like a face-to-face conversation with somebody, maybe I just name it like, again, there's so many things that it depends on, and what's my relationship with the person, what's even the person's background. There's so many things to kind of bear in mind. But maybe in person, I'll say something like, if I want to just get right to it, maybe I'll say, okay, yeah, that's a real issue, but I think you're trying to deflect from what we're talking about. So yes, we can talk about that, but let's stick with what I just named. So, what's your reaction to this thing that I named? Disconnected from this other completely separate thing, right? So, that's maybe something in person. Online, it's a whole different approach because I feel no obligation to debate people on the internet.
You don't even know
So,
if it's a real person or a bot. Like, you do not know if it's a real person or a bot.
that too. Oh my goodness. Absolutely that. Absolutely that. So, that actually does point to another piece of just really good big picture advice, because so many of us spend a lot of time on social media. And then sometimes we can kind of subconsciously forget the difference between like online conversation and interactions as opposed to in person with people you actually have physical, you know, just access to. And, sometimes we'll really expend a lot of emotional energy trying to like win this argument with an anonymous stranger online, which almost never goes anywhere productive.
No.
And I've gotten to the point where I can sniff out those kind of arguments made in bad faith very, very quickly. And almost every single time I've been making content for almost 3 years now, like seriously making content for almost 3 years now. And almost every single time when someone sort of dropped in, even if the language was kind of neutral or respectful, the language was framed, but something seemed kind of off. And there have been times where I've taken time to write, hey, let me break it down. I'm happy to, tell you about this. And then their follow-up response always makes it clear, oh yeah, this was not made in good faith.
No.
They're not actually looking for a conversation. They just want to waste my time and fight with me. So, let's all, collectively just have eyes for that. So we're not wasting time and we're not getting sucked into spaces that maybe are stressing us out, but are not actually real. So,
That are not
that's
real.
something else for us. Yeah, for sure. With AI kind of getting added to the mix too. The internet future is pretty scary when it comes to any sort of social discourse. So definitely, let's all make sure we're really wise in how we expend energy.
Absolutely. And I have to now ask about, how do we begin the process of decolonizing our minds? Because this is not just something that white folks need to do. We all need to decolonize our minds. Where do we even begin, Tony?
Yeah, so I think that there are, I'm going to kind of generalize, just hopefully this will make things more clear in how I think about this. Because I think just this work, I'll just sort of use that in a broad, sorry, my alarm there. And so I'll use this sort of a broad sense of, I'll just, the capital W work, we'll say the work, right? I think we have to be very holistic when it comes to that. And so definitely, I think a lot of people's thinking start off as like, hey, let me read all the books. Let me, follow people online. Let me watch certain educational movies. Like, yes, like there's absolutely, we need to just have some of the foundational information. Some people think that's kind of it, and that can be problematic. And also some people are not necessarily discerning enough in terms of who they are learning from. what does this person have to gain? What is their background? Do they offer lived experience in addition to their perspective? Like, those sorts of different things. But then also too, we have to have more relationships. We have to actually start to have more human connection with people who have backgrounds that are different from ours. There was a study that I read from, I want to say, I forget if it was 2017, it might have been 2017 or somewhere in that ballpark. And again, this is, of course, again, my context in the US. So, forgive me to the Australian audience. I just don't know what the statistics are there. But in the US, it was a study that showed that 75% of white people had zero meaningful relationships with people who are not whites. 75%. This does not include, the person who works at your favorite cafe. This does not include the random coworker that maybe you cross paths with and say hello to. I mean, meaningful, real relationship and friendship. And then that number jumped to, I want to say 90 or 91% had zero meaningful relationships with Black people. And when you lack those relationships, there's a lot of imagination work that goes into how you understand people and how you understand social issues. I can think of my own journey, especially of gaining real life relationships with LGBTQ community members. I grew up in I would say, a pretty socially kind of conservative religious background, where there was definitely a lot of sort of negativity towards LGBTQ community. And then just as an adult, I kind of unintentionally ended up learning that several of my closest friends, they would come out to me. And then suddenly I'm in relationship and community with people I've known for years, and they're kind of in adulthood discovering their own queer journeys. And then suddenly I'm like my mind is blown. Like all these questions that I had, all these ways that maybe I would try to be advocating or try to ally, it just doesn't hit the same compared to when you have a real life relationship with people. Your advocacy is so much stronger. Your perspectives, even your default reactions to situations is different when you have relationship. You have people who you love that represent these marginalized communities. So I think those are a couple of really big things when it comes to decolonizing our minds. And then I'd say added on top of all of that is that we must have more international perspectives as well. A lot of I hope it's better in Australia than it is in the States, because I know in the States we're very insular in terms of our social perspectives, very, very insular, even to the point where people are surprised and taken aback when we do travel internationally to discover that people just have completely different ways of engaging various social situations compared to what we have in the States. And so there's certain ways that I didn't realize how American I was until I traveled internationally. And all this sort of, and I don't mean that as a good thing. I learned some not so good things, ways that I was dehumanizing people in various interactions, ways that I was impatient in terms of time. Like, hey, I'm calling for a food order. If it's an hour and I don't got my food, I'm irritated. That's like so American, where it's like, just relax, the food's gonna be there. Like they're making it from scratch. In Tanzania, if I order a fish order, maybe they're literally walking over to the fisherman who just caught the fish 2 hours ago.
That's
like,
right.
Relax, Tony. Certain things that I just wouldn't have caught otherwise if I didn't have this exposure to leaving my home country to, be able to just understand and live with other people as well. So, I was kind of I was given a hard time to, social media and the internet kind of thing. But I will say, on the other hand, because not everybody has the ability to travel like that. So I don't want to make any sort of illusion that, oh yeah, everybody just buy a ticket and travel. And not everybody can do that. I will say that social media can offer us some unique peeks into just other parts of our own societies and even internationally as well, where we can just start, hey, let me start just looking for people who make social content from this country or from this background, or so on and so forth. Maybe you're somebody who is wanting to be a better LGBTQ ally. Go and look for trans content creators who talk about their identities and the lives as trans people and advocacy work. Look for queer content creators. Look for you can find people who talk about their lived experiences. Not only just from like sometimes from a social activist perspective, and sometimes from a I can think of a particular trans creator who was documenting her journey of starting to get on estrogen and taking shots and starting to change her hair and starting to just certain like her process. And it was just so interesting, but then also just beautiful to see this person just sharing their life. They weren't necessarily just teaching about stuff, but just, hey, this is life. I'm just trying to do my thing and live life and be happy. And that sort of stuff can have a very humanizing impact on our own views and perspectives, which I think is a huge part of decolonizing our minds.
That is so powerful about the humanization bit, because when I was thinking about how dehumanizing tactics that have been used when we refer to people as things that are not human, calling them names that belong to animals and so on and so forth, dehumanizing them. And when we dehumanize, we do not look at them as somebody who needs to be loved, somebody that we need to be in relationship with. It's actually taken me back to the genocide that happened in Rwanda many, many years ago, where one particular group, was referring to another as cockroaches. They are cockroaches that need to be squashed. And so when you think of them that way, you've removed the humanity in them. And so they're not anything that you value or love or can have relationship with. And the same goes with every other, intersecting identities that are marginalized. And I love how you've just brought home the importance of relationship, Tony. And so I would love to highlight the community that you're building. You're building an anti-racism community. You're behind the scenes putting together something incredible. Where can you just tell us a little bit about that community, what you're planning to create, and how people can get on the wait list?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just have had so many conversations with people who are passionate about racial equity work, who want to get engaged, who care, who are, learning to use their voices, all these kinds of things. And a lot of people who feel, they're really passionate about this, but then feel a sense of kind of insecurity in terms of, am I doing the right stuff? Is this the way I should be going? I really care about this, but I don't want to say the wrong thing. Am I, virtue signaling? Am I, being a white savior? Like all these things where people care, but just feel a lot of uncertainty in terms of their actual impact and how they're going about it. So that's one big thing. And another big thing is that sometimes people feel, gosh, I care about this stuff. I'm learning, I'm studying, I'm trying to, reshare things, blah, blah, blah. But I feel so alone in my home context. Nobody in my family cares about this. Nobody in my community cares about this. And I feel really unsupported and kind of demoralized about that. So I kept hearing these types of things so often that it just sort of light bulb moment of, oh my gosh, I need to make a community around this. Like I already have such access to so many people who are caring about this work and want resources, want tools, and then maybe even sometimes just want events, or maybe sometimes have a situation where they just want to get feedback. Hey, this thing happened. Here's how I responded, but I feel kind of weird about it. What would you have done? Those sorts of different things. Or maybe people are just really excited about something. Hey, Uncle so-and-so, we're talking about Uncle so-and-so, came to the family gathering and said this thing. And for the first time ever, like I jumped in and said, hey, that's not cool. Don't do that. I just got to tell somebody about that. We can celebrate together, right? That's why it occurred to me that, gosh, we need to create a space for this. And I'm just not very aware of many other community spaces that have that level of intentionality coupled with that level of humanity, where we can just kick it. We can just kind of be together. I can support a learning journey, but then also we can support each other as people who share that passion for racial equity and justice. And so that's where this idea of this community has come together. And
Wow.
the beautiful, magical thing with the internet is that we can hold space together, even from across the globe,
That's right.
even from different time zones. Like I'm in a dramatically different time zone in Costa Rica
Yes.
now. But again, I was living in Tanzania, which was 9 hours ahead of my time now, something like that. The internet allows us to be able to hold space in that
Absolutely.
way, even with different locations and time zones. And so,
Mhm.
if that sort of idea resonates for folks, I would love for people to join my wait list, sort of a mailing list to be able to learn when that's going to launch. We are closing in on the platform being ready for official launch. So, people, the best way to get on the list for the mailing list to hear about that and just other stuff I've got going on is to go to my Instagram at racial equity insights, just at racial equity insights. Sorry, that's the Instagram. And then on my pinned posts, there's a picture of
Yes,
me
there
looking
is.
really excited with a yellow background that says like community on it. And just follow the directions on that,
Yep.
and it'll take you to a page where you can get on my mailing list. That's
Beautiful.
the best thing that you can do. So that way, as soon as the community is available, you can get first dibs on signing up.
All right.
And I want to be able to kind of get people together. So it's probably not going to be just always open. I'm probably going to open it up for periods of time.
Okay.
So getting on
Okay.
the list ensures that you're not going to miss out when the window is available for people to sign up.
Brilliant. And I'm going to link that. I'm going to put that on to the show notes so that people can click and immediately get to that post, Tony. And that just makes it really, really
Perfect.
easy for them. I have one last question before we go. And this is a question that I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. If fear was not a factor, Tony, how would you show up in your work?
Ooh, that's a big question. Um, ooh, I like that. So I think that, and the reason why I like that so much is you're connecting in with stuff like kind of personal work that I'm currently, like literally currently doing. I think for me, I would be much more intentional with showing just more parts of my life. So much of my content is me teaching. So there's a specific subject I want to give people information about. Hey, let me give you examples of this. Let me show you this. Let me give you this list of reading materials, like just a lot of teaching stuff. And I never want there to be this idea that I am not more than just a person who provides teaching materials. Like I want people to, speaking of humanizing, I want to humanize my own self in terms of how I engage my work. And I want people to be able to see more of the vulnerable sides of me, more of the just kind of regular life sides of me. And I think that when people can see that, for example, hey, this guy who does all this teaching and does all these trainings, he likes Star Wars like I do, or, he plays
Mhm.
video games like I do, or,
Yeah.
he has mental health challenges like I do. Those are all things that are true about me. I just want for people to be able to feel that they're seen also. And so that's something that's a challenge for me because I don't like people to have access to some of that stuff beyond just, hey, here's professional Tony.
That's right.
But that's something that, is an active part of my journey and work, like literally right now in the present. So yeah, thank you for that question. That's a wonderful question.
And probably an act of decolonizing that we're not just showing up as professionals with the hat that we've
Yes.
been told to wear, but we can actually show up
Exactly.
as that photographer who loves, because I know you love taking photos, right?
I
And
do.
just
I
showing
do.
that lighter side of you where someone goes like, I really like this person. I just feel connected, that know, like, and trust factor. And then that just kind of gets them in a little bit deeper. So thank you for sharing so vulnerably and honestly about that. Because I know some people go like, oh, fear is your friend. So I'm good with fear. And I'm like, okay. um, but I'm just so grateful that you answered that. You were really vulnerable with that. Now, where is the best place that people can find you? Somebody listening going like, I need to know where I can find Tony, connect with him. Where's the best place?
Yeah, so I would say one of two places. In terms of social media, Instagram is absolutely my primary. I do a little bit on TikTok. I do even less on LinkedIn, but I'm on those platforms. But Instagram is the best social media at Racial Equity Insights. And then also my website, just www.racialequityinsights.com. I say especially for folks who are specifically wanting resources. I have on-demand e-courses people
Yes, you
can
do.
buy, get access to there. Thank you. And then also I do trainings and workshops and strategy development and coaching, all that sort of stuff for organizations too. So the website's a great place to be able to learn about some of that and then to be able to contact me directly too.
Amazing. Tony, thank you so much for your time. This conversation has been amazing. I know we could have gone deeper. I still have the question between Tanzanians and South Africans, the difference when it comes to race, like how they show up and how they're doing life differently. I didn't get to that and other things. So we must have you back on here again if you're willing to come back. But
That
thank
sounds
you
great.
so much for your time. I'm 16 hours ahead of you. So thank you so, so much for your time. And we'll pop all those links for everybody in the show notes. Tony, thank you.
Thank you for having me, Annie. It's been a joy.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a review so this podcast can reach more online business owners, and together we can begin to normalize racial inclusion in the online coaching space. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this podcast episode was recorded, the Wiradjuri people in central New South Wales, Australia. Music produced in Nairobi, Kenya by Patrick St. P. Mbaru and Kambua Mathu. Vocals by Joanne Matata.
Represented.